This is the EWN Podcast Network.
Welcome to Late Boomers, our podcast guide to creating your third act with style, power, and impact. Hi, I'm Cathy Worthington.
And I'm Mary Elkins. Join us as we bring you conversations with successful entrepreneurs, entertainers, and people with vision who are making a difference in the world.
Everyone has a story, and we'll take you along for the ride on each interview, recounting the journey our guests have taken to get where they are, inspiring you to create your own path to success. Let's get started.
Hello, I'm Cathy Worthington. Welcome to the Late Boomers podcast. Today we're going to talk about writing and storytelling. And we have as our guest writing coach and ghostwriter Autumn Karen, who is also a filmmaker and college professor.
And I'm Mary Elkins. Many of you boomers out there, including me, are working on books or screenplays or memoirs. Autumn has a lot to say about her work as a ghostwriter and how she helps people create compelling narratives that resonate with audiences. Welcome, Autumn.
Thank you so much for having me, Merry and Cathy. I'm so excited to be here.
Great to have you.
Great to have you. And how has your own life experience led you to the work you're doing on film and with ghostwriting and with your writing students today?
Well, one of the big things about my own life experience is that, I grew up, we were just talking about my mom before we started recording, but I grew up with my mom and grandmother telling stories. So I grew up with single mom and my grandmother raised us, and they were forever talking to people like at yard sales, and they would invite people in off the street, and everywhere we went, like as kids, we'd be like, Mom, come on, we have to go. And Mom would just be listening to someone's life story, like standing in line at the grocery store. And we would always just tug on her. And so that is where a lot of the storytelling for me comes from. And we, of course, sat around telling stories in the family. We had a really strong network of women in my family. So my grandmother was one of 7 sisters, and the sisters, 5 of them lived in the town that I grew up in. So we would go visit them every Sunday after church, sit on their couch and eat hard candy and hear stories about their lives. And so that is really where storytelling came from for me, was sitting on their couches, listening to them and my grandmother talk about their childhood.
Oh,
and then
what
their
a great way to grow up.
It was a great way to grow up. Absolutely.
Did they all grow up in North Carolina? Where did they all grow up?
They are all from North Carolina. So my grandmother grew up she was born in a little mill town called Oxford, North Carolina. And when the Great Depression hit, my great-grandfather put them all in a truck. There were 9 kids, 2 boys and 7 girls. 2 of the kids stayed in Oxford. The other 7 got on the truck. She was 9 years old, and they drove to Roanoke Rapids, which is where the cotton mills were in North Carolina. And they gave the family a house, which is the same house I grew up in. And then all the sisters lived there. They all worked in the cotton mills. So she had to quit school when she was 14 to go work in the cotton mills. And then I grew up in that same house. So they all the sisters except for 2 had to quit school and go work in the cotton mills. And then 2 got to go to high school. And one actually ended up in LA. One of them, she was the youngest. She ended up going to art school and landed in Santa Monica and used to do animation and drawing work out in Los Angeles. So she's the one who got away.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, very,
it's so fun for me because my mother grew up on a farm outside Greenville, North Carolina.
Oh,
so
yeah, that's right near there.
And her mother never left the state of North Carolina in her whole life. The kids went out, but 2 of the kids never left also. There were 8 kids that survived. Mm-hmm. So big family like that on a farm. So it's very interesting to me to hear that. But how did all of that, I hear you talk about the storytelling, but how did that lend itself to film and ghostwriting and the other things you do?
So ghostwriting was an accident. I started out college as an actress and then decided I wanted to do something more meaningful. ended up getting my bachelor's in women's health, and then went on to get, I know, like I look back on it now and it's like terrible. But that's what at the time I was like, I have to do something that like, I was like, I want to go join the Peace Corps. I want to like do something. Ended up getting my master's in special education and was working in special ed. But I was the primary breadwinner. And, my partner at the time, he's never liked having a job. Like, it's just never been his thing. So I started doing more work on the side because I had 4 kids and had to feed them. And teacher salary is just not enough, not even close. So I started writing online. I started writing lesson plans, and then turned into blogs, and that turned into ebooks. And then I ended up working for a vanity press. So a lot of it was just necessity. Like, I found out that I was good at it. And people ask, how do you write so many words? It's like, when you have to feed the kids, you can suddenly finish projects.
That's true for a lot of people. Well, tell our audience actually what ghostwriting is and what it takes to get into this field of work, because I know several people, that's their main career.
So ghostwriting is when you write in the voice of another person, and I jokingly call it professional lying because I write it and then someone else publishes it as though they wrote it. And it is a lot like acting. When I teach ghostwriting at the university level, and in the book that I have coming out later this year on ghostwriting, I really talk about it being the marriage of method acting and of creative writing, and then of relational interviewing from anthropology, which I learned a lot about in my undergrad. And in that sense, I really see ghostwriting as being a conduit in very anthropological, sociological terms, that I am the conduit for someone else's voice who cannot articulate it in the way that it needs to be articulated. So it's almost like a social sciences take on ghostwriting.
I love that.
Yeah. It's a very interesting take on it.
Yeah.
When
I just wanted to say, is it different when you're writing a book or a screenplay or adapting a novel to the screen? Or is there any difference, or is it all basically the same process?
Screenplays are, first of all, gloriously different. Books are such long form content and we want to sit and simmer, right? You want more detail. When I'm writing a novel, a memoir, that kind of thing, I want more detail. So you're kind of digging deeper and deeper and pulling the words out. Screenplays are so fast, and you have to like get in and get out, and you have to cut things. So I would say that in some ways screenwriting is more truth maybe than book writing, because there's just not time. You have to just get to it. And I really like that. So when we talk about adaptation is a real thing. So if you go see like a movie adaptation of your favorite book and it's so different, that's because they're substantively different mediums. So you it cannot be the same, and it shouldn't be the same. So yeah, I think that answers your question, Mary.
Yeah. I know people always say, oh my gosh, the movie isn't nearly as good as the book. Well, yes, they have to cut like at least half of it, maybe more, to make it into a movie. It's like, but when you sit down with a client as a ghostwriter, what is your process? How do you work with people to produce a product in which you can both take pride?
So let me say, first of all, I really don't have an ego in it when I'm ghostwriting. So a product that we can both take pride in, I don't really think of it that way. I really am a conduit. And it's kind of the same thing raising my own kids, right? I always tell my kids, I don't care what you do when you grow up, as long as you find something that you're passionate about. It doesn't matter. And so I'm going to support you in anything. And the same thing is with ghostwriting. We can talk about form and content, and I will like push people towards, let's get to the heart of it. Or I'm working with a client right now. I'm like fighting for them to keep something in that's very vulnerable in their book. And I'm like, I think that this needs to stay in. I think it speaks a lot to your authenticity. But at the end, if they decide to cut it, that's their choice. Like that's completely, it's their piece. It's not my story. So I don't think that I'm parenting my clients, but in some ways it's similar in that sense. And when I start working with a client, we always start with goals. Like, what do you want out of this book? When somebody puts your book down, what is the feeling you want them to have? Because we are driven by feelings. Stephen King
That's
talks
a
about
great
this in
place
his
to
writing.
start.
Yeah.
Great place
Yeah.
to start. Yeah. Is there a quote from Stephen King that you give to people?
Well, there's a sentiment from Stephen King, which is that people engage with his books the first time to feel, and the second time they read them to think. So we want to engage them in the feeling place first. It all starts with emotion. So that's where I start with clients, and then we kind of back out of like, what story do we want to tell? Because it is not your whole life. Like, I am sorry, as long as books are, I'm always like, we can write more books, but we can't put it all in the first one. It just won't fit. So let's not
I
try.
get it.
That's
I get
true.
it.
Even with a memoir,
Wow.
you can't do that either. But but how do you? First of all, my question to you would be: do they always have like an outline, or have they written something before, or do you go in when they say call you and say, "I'd like to write a book about, please come help"? How does that work?
It completely depends on the person. So I have done every possible iteration of this. I have a more recent client who I wrote nothing. They only wanted me to be there as a sounding board, and that really becomes more developmental editing and writing coaching. So I do that where I don't write any words. I wrote a book for a client who left like a really famous cult a few years ago. He was like on Netflix and all those things. And I wrote every single word of that book. Like, they were not really involved in it. It was completely
fascinating,
like turnkey. And I've had clients like that where I just invent like whole swaths.
Wow.
I recently finished a book for a client where we were towards the end, and they were actually not the one that hired me. Someone else hired me, and they passed away right before we were done. And so they had given their blessing on most of it, right? But the last few chapters was really me and their family, like, wrapping it up. So you can work with kind of anything. I have had it happen a few times where I have had somebody come to me with a book that they had paid somebody to write previously and they weren't happy with it, and then I will rewrite it. So in that case, I have like a whole lot to work with. We can do anything.
Yeah. Well, how do you balance staying true to someone else's story, their real life story, and at the same time create a narrative that's engaging and dramatic that'll capture the reader's attention?
I think it's more about arranging puzzle pieces. I don't believe generally in memoir, especially in writing cradle to grave. So we are not going to start with your birth and like end with where you are. That's not how it's going to go. I do tend to have like, I want to open strongly with any kind of book. So whatever is a really impactful moment, I've started books with like a client's spiritual experience or suicide or like the birth of a child or something. Like, we want to open the book. So really where that comes in is more structure, because voice is a different thing.
Wow.
And so we structure things in a way that really speaks to them. And I will be honest that I don't really believe in like rigid mores in writing. I'm not, even though I'm an English professor, I don't believe in like, this is how books have to be. And so I always experiment. It's like, what sounds good? What feels good? I worked with a client on a book last year. He just retired from Boston Ballet, and he has a tremendous life. And we ended up structuring his book through intersectional identity based on the work of Audre Lorde. And so it was like, we're going to retell the chapters of your life through the lens of being a dancer, being a Vietnamese man, being a gay man, being a father, being in love. And so you kind of retold the stories because that's how he talks.
Oh, I love
so
that.
It's more of like, let's capture how you tell your story and then put it through the lens of something else that kind of helps us to structure it. But how do you actually talk about your life? Because that's really interesting.
Sure is.
Yeah.
It's a really great way to look at it, and the retelling. But what about if you're writing fiction, but you use conflict from real life stories? Like, how do you weave fiction around those stories?
So that is like my favorite way to write in film, especially. I have a feature film in pre-production called 1999 that is based on my life growing up in Roanoke Rapids, in a little small town, and how my journey with my best friend, we kind of grew apart in large part because of like racial dynamics in our hometown, and kind of that transition from high school to college, and then it's all told through the lens of the films of 1999, because that's when and so
Fun.
it's a
Already, I love it.
Remind us what some of the films from 1999
Yeah.
are that you would mention.
It is like the best year in film, y'all. It's like The Matrix and American Beauty. Although, I mean, American Beauty is problematic these days, but Fight Club, Sixth Sense, Wild Wild West. Oh gosh, there are so many. Varsity Blues, Cruel Intentions. I mean, it was a huge year in film. Blair Witch Project. So it's kind of told through the lens of these girls, like going to see movies and being obsessed with movies, and then how do their lives diverge, and then we tell that through film as well. So there's that, and then I currently have in production. I'll get started talking now.
When is that coming out? I want to see that one.
That one is in pre-production. We are hoping to shoot it summer of 2026 when school is out. That's the current plan.
It's a while from now.
It's a while. Pre-production is long, and then that's because we currently have in production a short film that is based on my experience losing a child to epilepsy, and it's animated.
Oh my!
Yeah, so I actually had a meeting with the animators this morning. It's in production, and Infinity Care is kind of sucking up the air out of the room for the moment. We have lots of other projects going on, and I have four. There are four of us, and they also have projects. We're doing a documentary on CRPS and Infinity Care in 1999. Then we're running a film contest, a script contest.
Oh boy, you are a busy lady.
Very busy lady, yes. And tell us about the types of conflict in real stories that you've ghostwritten.
So I'll start with Infinity Care in terms of conflict. Infinity Care is a short film that focuses on the intersection of grief and capitalism. And the conflict is external in terms of we go through the loss of this little girl to epilepsy and the seizure that kills her. So that's external conflict. But then the mother has a deep level of internal conflict because the little girl is severely disabled. And so there is a conflict between her desire to have an able-bodied child, which is a really common conflict that special needs parents experience, and then also loving the child that she has, like loving the child in front of her, but also wishing that she didn't have these struggles. And so anytime we have conflict in something that is ghostwritten, we're always looking for that internal conflict and external conflict in a real person.
Yeah.
I get it partly, but I leave it to you to be the expert on that. It sounds very complicated.
Well, but we all are that way as human beings. There's always an internal and external.
It's hard to write
conflict.
it down.
Very. Yeah. And without always saying what it is, right?
Yeah.
So talk about ethical considerations when you're using a real life experience, either your own or others' experiences.
So the big ethical thing is kind of like doctors. We want to do no harm. And sometimes we talk about fictionalizing things. Sometimes that does mean fictionalizing in order to protect people. And I always tell clients, it is perfectly fine for us to like stretch things or change things slightly if you want to protect people. I had a case of that with a client a couple years ago with a book. There was this very violent act that happened in their life, and the people involved, had we written it that way, would have been like hurt, would have been, if this had been public, that it was within the family. So I rewrote it so that it seemed as though it were outside of the family, but we still got that emotional resonance. So we still got that external conflict, and we still got to see not the entirety of the internal conflict for the person, but at least some of it.
Mm.
And so that's a big ethical consideration.
Can you give an example as far as perhaps to go deeper into detail, perhaps with that or another story?
Oh gosh, I have so many non-disclosure agreements, y'all.
Oh, of course. Don't violate anything like that.
No, don't.
No, I am super careful with my non-disclosures. In terms of internal conflict and external conflict, that's a hard one. The one that I can actually talk about in more detail than that.
Okay.
Well, I can talk about the book that I wrote for James Hart Stern. He was the Black preacher who took over the KKK from a prison cell. And one of the things in his book was how he characterized him and his relationship with Edgar Ray Killen, because he didn't want to characterize it as any more than it was, right? It was kind of like a line to toe. And James was like a very earnest guy. He passed away from bladder cancer in 2019. But he was an incredibly earnest and open man. And he wanted to lay it bare, but also to really characterize Killen in the way that he believed was authentic. And that was challenging, because we don't really see any instances, like we're looking for, and ideally, if I were fictionalizing this, ideally I would find some kind of redemption for this man. Right? If I were writing him as a character, I would find some kind of redemption for Killen. And that's what I wanted to. Like, I kept looking, I was like, surely he's a human. There must be some redemptive quality. And there was not. And so there was I hate to be that way. There was not. He was a stone cold killer and a horrible racist. And so I kept looking as I was writing that book. And I kept asking James, I was like, well, certainly, like, we could find something to humanize him. And we had many, many sessions working on my book, and it just was not to be. It would have made it a more interesting book, but it was not true. And so I had an obligation, obviously, to the truth, to never, humanize him.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's so hard to find that in a human being, because somewhere along the line, the person thinks they're doing the right thing. Don't they?
Oh, gosh. So for those not familiar with Killen committed the Mississippi burning murder. So he murdered 3 young civil rights workers in 1964. And then he confessed another 32, 34 murders. It's been a while since I've looked, to Stern while they were in prison together. And he wrote this down in the letters that James came out with. I don't think so. I don't think that there was any part of him that thought that there was any moral imperative. I think that he could do it, and he got away with it for 30 years before he was even brought to justice. So I don't know. I never got that from James and from all the listening that I did to interviews with Killen and things like that. I never spoke to Killen myself, so I can't say I have firsthand knowledge. But
well, what would you say is the key to capturing the original writer's voice when ghostwriting? And how do you ensure your work captures their message and voice and therefore has impact?
I will say some of it comes in what other people might consider bad writing. I think that a lot of people, and I've actually had clients, who I had to part ways with, because I believe that grammar is a social construct. And as much as we want clarity, there's things like passive voice, right? Or the use of prepositional phrases, things like that. I can get rid of all of that. I know how to do all that. But that doesn't sound like a real person. And so you have to get rid of some of it. I mean, there is some of it that you have to pull up passive voice in order for there to be clarity. But then I also think you have to leave it in, or else it doesn't sound like the person. One of the biggest ethical conundrums I think I've had as a ghostwriter is when I have clients who are like, want me to make it sound like they contextualize it like, I want you to make me sound smart.
Yeah,
And
of
so they'll
course.
like have me go
Oh.
in and like rewrite things in a more academic tone. And I'm like, that's not your lived experience. Like they might be a high school dropout. I'm like, that doesn't make your experience less. So you're trying to like mold yourself. And I think that's disingenuous.
That's a writer's dilemma. Like, totally across the board.
Even
You
when
want
you're
to,
making up a character, right, Mary?
oh
Even
yeah,
you're making up a character, you have to be
yeah,
careful how their voice is, right?
absolutely. And they could be very academic, that particular character, but other characters not. Especially these days, because we all speak in a different colloquialist tone. So
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that it's a big challenge. And when we're trying to capture someone's voice, I think it's very important to break the rules. I work with a lot of people and traditionally have worked with a lot of non-English speakers. So I'm like, it's English is their second language, not non-English speakers. English is their second language. And I feel like the cadence of their language is so beautiful. I'm like, it's so beautiful the way that like the Arabic language or Vietnamese or whatever, like changes the way that you phrase things. And I want to preserve that. And if that makes it
Mhm.
sound awkward in the book, okay. Like, so it's authentic and interesting. But
Mhm.
people often disagree with me on that.
yeah. Well,
So,
talking about
Yeah,
challenges,
yeah.
talk about the biggest challenges writers faced when starting or finishing projects, and how do you coach clients to get through those roadblocks?
so the biggest piece is to have some kind of community and accountability. This does not happen in a vacuum. I don't work in a vacuum. I am
Mhm.
actually a little bit stuck on a book right now for a client. Their story is tremendous, and I have not feel like I have my hand. It's the only book that I'm working on right now. I'm working on my ghostwriting book, but it's the only memoir that I'm working on right now. And I'm just like, which is unusual. I've never only had one memoir before. I usually have two going. And so you have to have community. And the way that I get around these things is to have somebody else read the work. And that is honestly, that's a universal writer's block remover, is to have somebody else come and read it. And usually, like the people I deliver it to are not going to say mean things because
Yeah.
I know who I'm giving it to. I know that they're going to give me constructive. They're going to say, hey, this part's really interesting, but I wish that I knew more about that. And then there's like, oh, okay. Well, now I can see where I have an opportunity. Whereas I couldn't right now. I don't see my opportunity in this book. So I have it out with a client, with a friend. And that's the biggest piece, is to have community. People think that you like sit down in front of the laptop and you just like bang it out. And there is some of that. And like I use Pomodoro timers, and I've got like timing techniques and meditation techniques. And, you know, when I have work days, I like block out whole days. And my partner, he knows that like I'm pieced out, and he's very supportive. He'll like bring me snacks and things. He's like, I know you're just gonna be on the couch all day with your Pomodoro. So I block out time, but then mostly I have to have community. It just doesn't work otherwise.
I laugh
I
because I'm identifying with
good.
everything that you said.
Yeah, Mary, work on that community part. That's a good piece.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can you also tell us what it takes for a writer to stick with his or her writing until it's done? And also the editing process.
So and this is a paraphrase of William Kenauer, whose book I've been teaching for many years in writing classes. Writing is an act of radical self-acceptance. You have to just accept who you are as you are writing. And if you're going to get to the end of the book, you have to like yourself. Like you have to like what you're writing. You have to follow your interest within whatever written work it is. And even as a ghostwriter, I am essentially following my own interests. I recognize, we talk about the ethics of it. I recognize how much of me is in these books, even when they don't have my name on them, because I am still engineering what question I ask. This is what I teach my ghostwriting students. The question that you ask a client is going to lead them in one direction or another. And it's like the butterfly effect, right? It changes everything. So And now I've forgotten your question.
Like what? Well, take. But well,
Oh,
what kind of?
I was asking what it takes to stick with it till it's done and the
Yeah,
editing process. Yeah.
Yeah, so it is that active radical self-acceptance. As far as the editing process, I find that I'm a heavier editor in screenplays. In all honesty, in books, by the time I get to a finished draft with a client, we have workshopped it so heavily along. I don't usually have big edits on books. And that's because like I'm a pre-planner. So when I write with someone, we get started. And then the first thing that I give them is we'll spend several weeks, maybe even several months talking, and I'm gathering information. And then I puzzle that information into a structure and outline before we start. So I don't, other writers might disagree. I don't really edit books. Like I don't, I've done that with other people, but when I'm working myself, we front load it so that it's like going downhill on the other side. And you're not like trying to figure out, does this chapter go here or there? It's like we've already outlined it. Like we know exactly. And then we've already, like I have that memoir that I have right now, they're looking at a draft of most of it. There's like about a third of it that I'm like stuck on. I'm like, I don't even know where we go. I got to figure this out. Even though I've got it outlined, I don't think it's one instance where I think my outline is bunk. I'm like, I dropped the ball on this one. This outline sucked. Like,
Yeah.
I need to like rework it.
Wow.
Yeah, no, it does. And some of it is with that particular book, it started out like chronologically. And that was the way that it made sense. And the further and further we've gone, I'm like, this book really needs to be idea based. Like it's not, the reader's not, it's too, their life is so freaking interesting. And I wish I could talk about them in more detail, but I have non-disclosure. Their life is so interesting.
Of course.
And,
well,
yeah.
A question. What kind of questions do you ask the writer in order to produce a book? What kind of questions should the writer be asking themselves? You mentioned it earlier about what's your goal, but what else?
So this is where relational interviewing comes into play. Relational interviewing and anthropology, and I really base mine on the work of Leanne Fuji, who's a tremendous anthropologist. We are letting them lead. So I might start out with an idea, and then I am engaged in active listening and responsive questioning. So if we start to go down one road, like if I'm like, tell me about your childhood, and you focus in on the relationship with your father, then we allow that to evolve. So maybe it starts out with you talking about your father when you were a child, and then suddenly you're talking about he's got dementia now. And then it becomes about that, and it becomes about you in the modern day. So allowing that to lead. The other thing is that books are made of stories. They're made of scenes. So you have to actually tell stories. We have to have like beginning and middle and end. So I need to hear the story about you and your mom cutting flowers in the backyard. And I need to hear, you may not remember exactly what kind of flowers they were, because we're going to fictionalize that if you don't. But what is your recollection of it? And you might say, oh, they were these big white flowers. And who will actually know? Maybe you'll never remember what exactly the flowers were, but we'll describe them in detail. But we have to have a scene. You have to have like an actual story. You can't just be like, I grew up here and then I went there. It's like, no, I grew up in a brick house on the corner and there were always cars going by, because then I can describe the cars, and then I can describe, and then you have to give me a beginning, middle, and end. Like it's not even enough to set that scene. And then one day a car was driving down the street and they ran into the yard and almost hit the dog. Like then comes the story. Mm-hmm. And then we had to put up a fence. Like whatever. You have to tell me an actual story.
Yeah.
Well, good example.
Yeah. Detail. So when are you most satisfied with your work? And tell us what you think is important in order for a story to inspire the reader.
Well, again, it all comes back to emotion. We have to tie what the person is reading to some kind of emotion. So, right, if the car came into your yard and like drove into your yard and it didn't bother you, then there's no point in telling that story. right? But if the car came and you were sitting right next to your dog and it made you feel something, then we can make the reader feel something. So that's so important, which is why, and this is true of every book almost every book I've ever written. I don't know. I wrote a book on farm finance once, so that one probably started differently. But the memoirs I work on, we start with something very deeply emotional. And that's what is the reader gonna feel? I've written a lot of nonfiction, like I'm looking up at my shelf, because I've got a whole shelf that y'all can't see on the other side of the room. That's all the books I've ghostwritten that I can't turn the camera around because that's all my non-disclosures sitting on the shelf. But so some of them I have written, like real estate books, or like I wrote a book on blended families once, and like it was very practical, and those are a little different. But for memoirs, you want them to feel something, just like when you feel something when you're sitting around the table with your parents or with your kids and you're telling stories about your life. Right? We want to have that kind of sense of sitting around the kitchen table, telling stories. And that's how you reach readers. If you are connecting like a human life to another human life, that's why AI doesn't work. And AI is never going to work because it's not connecting a human life to another human life.
At least right now.
And
hopefully never.
I don't think it can do it. I don't think it can do what we do. I do think that there are places that can be helpful. Like I'm not, if I'm like, I don't know, like it's certainly helpful for coding, or like it can help me like with my calendar. Like there's very like great logical things it can help me with, but
yeah,
it's not true. Coming for us. Not as a substantive way.
Yes. Well, I'm glad you feel that way. Wish I were more sure about that. But Autumn, tell our audience what you'd like to have them have as a takeaway today.
My biggest takeaway is that your story matters. You may not think it does. You may think that nobody wants to hear it, but there is somebody who needs to hear whatever story you're trying to tell. The difference in the work that I do, both as a filmmaker and a book writer, is that we find platforms. I help people find a platform to tell it. But that's really privilege. And when we talk about the ethics of it, it is a privilege to be able to tell your story because not everybody has that level, has that ability to tell them. There's a reason that out of 28 books, I think 24 of them I have written for men. And it's because women have less money. Like women tend to have less disposable income to pay my fee. So I always think about what a privilege it is to be able to tell your story. So that's my takeaway.
I love that. We all have our own voices, don't we? And every voice can be inspirational. I love that. Thank you. Thank you, Autumn. Thank you for our audience and for me and Late Boomers. Our guest today on Late Boomers has been Autumn Karen, filmmaker, ghostwriter, and college professor. You can reach Autumn via her website, autumnkaren.com. And that's Autumn spelled like the season, AUTUMN, Karen, KAREN.com. Thank you.
And tune in next week when we will be meeting Anmol Singh, a consultant in the trading and investing industry. We'll really switch. He has advice for all of us on how to be a success in life. Please subscribe to our Late Boomers podcast on YouTube and take us along in the car and on walks on your favorite audio platform. Let us know what gets you inspired. We are on Instagram at I am Cathy Worthington and at I am Mary Elkins and at Late Boomers. Please share the Late Boomers podcast info with your friends who may not yet be listening to podcasts. Thanks again, Autumn.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us on Late Boomers, the podcast that is your guide to creating a third act with style, power, and impact. Please visit our website and get in touch with us at lateboomers.biz. If you would like to listen to or download other episodes of Late Boomers, go to ewnpodcastnetwork.com.
This podcast is also available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and most other major podcast sites. We hope you make use of the wisdom you've gained here and that you enjoy a successful third act with your own style, power, and impact.